Have you ever felt that everyone around you play a power game that you don't know the rules? That emptiness in the stomach when someone gets what they want while you still waiting for your chance? It is no accident. The masters of power know it. Seduction is a hidden art that transcends romanticism to infiltrate every aspect of our lives. Today I break the silence about a method that the powerful have kept jealously for centuries. If what you are listening already causes a chill of recognition, I like it right now. Because what I am going to reveal could change your way of moving on this invisible board. The prohibited manuscripts of Machiavelli contain secrets that go far beyond the prince. Secrets that elites have used for generations to manipulate wills without raising suspicions. Get ready to discover the method that nobody dares to name. Nicholas Machiavelli walked through the dark corridors of the Vecchio Palace in Florence, their steps echoing against the old stone while the powerful whispered around them. Few know that this man, relegated to history as a simple political theorist, hid among his writings a complete system of human influence that went far beyond the simple administration of power. What I am about to reveal was written in the pages that never published, those that immediately hid them and only circulated among the initiates for centuries. The true mastery of Machiavelli did not live in teaching the princes how to govern with a hard hand, but in something much more subtle, how to infiltrate the human mind without activating their defenses. Have you ever wondered why certain people get everyone to give in to their wishes without apparent effort? Why do some individuals, without possessing extraordinary beauty or an obvious charisma, make everyone dance to the rhythm of their invisible music? The answer lies in what Machiavelli called the silent conquest, a method that begins with a devastating principle. Most people live in a constant illusion of freedom, when in reality they yearn to be directed. This is the first uncomfortable truth to accept. Human beings fear true freedom because it implies responsibility. They desperately seek figures that provide them direction while maintaining the illusion of autonomy. The forbidden method does not begin with action, but with a strategic stillness. Machiavelli understood that true power is never announced, never begs attention. The first phase of Machiavellian seduction is to become a perfect mirror, such a subtle reflection that the other does not perceive that it is being studied. During this period, the master of influence becomes an empty receptacle, absorbing every detail, every unpaired desire, every silenced fear. Do you remember the last time you felt deeply understood by someone you barely knew? That moment when your barriers inexplicably fell to a stranger? It is likely that you have experienced this first phase of the method. The person who seduced you was not offering you a genuine connection, but using the receptive vacuum technique, creating a seemingly safe space where to deposit your most intimate desires. The prohibited manuscripts detail how Machiavelli used this technique to gain the confidence of the Medici after being tortured by them. Imagine the power of a method that can turn your executors into protectors. This is the dark potential we are exploring, a potential that resides in the understanding that people do not seek the truth, but confirmation of their own internal narratives. The silent conquest requires absolute patience. In an era of instant gratification, few have the discipline to master this first step, but those who achieve it acquire almost supernatural power, the ability to read others as open books while they remain as indecipherable enigmas. Do you begin to understand why this knowledge has been reserved for a few? Most leave this path to discover that the temporal suppression of the ego requires. To become a teacher of Machiavellian seduction, you must first give up the need to be seen, to be validated. You must inhabit silence and shadow until the precise moment of emerging is presented. Only then, when you have completely mapped the emotional territory of your goal, you can proceed to the next step of the forbidden method. The second component of Machiavellian forbidden is perhaps the most counterintuitive, the presence through absence. In his secret writings, Machiavelli reveals a truth that contradicts everything they have taught us about social influence. The man who is always present loses value like the air we breathe, becomes invisible precisely because of his constancy. This principle, so simple in its formulation but so difficult in its execution, challenges our basic instinct to remain visible to those we want to influence. The technique of strategic absence operates under a deep psychological premise. Human beings only value what they fear to lose. When you become omnipresent, you become a guaranteed element of the emotional landscape of the other, as notable as the walls that surround it. Imagine for a moment the emptiness left by the sun when hidden behind the clouds after days of constant heat. Suddenly his absence becomes more powerful than his previous presence. This is the effect we seek to create. After establishing a significant connection using the receptive vacuum that we discussed previously, the master of Machiavellian seduction is partially withdrawn, creating a longing space that is almost physically painful for the objective. This withdrawal should never be complete or hostile. We are not talking about superficial manipulative techniques such as becoming difficult. The strategic absence is much more subtle. It consists in gradually reducing the emotional intensity you previously offered, creating a contrast that is disconcerting without being obvious. The objective will begin to ask, "What has changed? I did anything wrong?" The fascinating thing about this technique is that it operates directly on the human attachment system, activating the same mechanisms that formed our first relationships with our caregivers. When the emotional presence that had become constant begins to fluctuate unpredictably, a primary anxiety response is triggered. The goal of your influence will unconsciously begin to work to recover the connection, investing more emotional energy than I would never have offered voluntarily. Machiavelli documented how he used this technique with Lorenzo de' Medici, alternating periods of close advice with strategic retreats to his villa in San Casciano. Every time he walked away, his ideas gained weight in the ruling's mind. Upon his return, he found Lorenzo more receptive, more anxious to retain his presence and wisdom. Modern psychology has confirmed what Machiavelli sensed. Intermittent reinforcement is the most powerful way to condition behavior. A guaranteed prize loses value. An unpredictable reward creates addiction. When your emotional presence becomes that intermittent reward, you generate a level of influence that transcends the conscious reason. There is a critical point in the application of this technique, a delicate threshold that separates the mastery of gross manipulation. If the absence extends too much or implemented in a clumsy way, the link is irreparably broken. Art lies in keeping hope alive while uncertainty is cultivated, in being like the horizon, always visible, but never completely attainable. Maybe now you begin to glimpse why this knowledge has remained hidden. In wrong hands, these techniques can cause considerable suffering, but in the hands of those who seek legitimate influence, the visionary leader, the social reformer, the artist who wants his message to resonate, become tools to overcome the natural resistance to change that we all experience. The third element of the forbidden Machiavelli method directly contradicts the image that the story has painted from it. While the prince speaks of clinging to power at all costs, his hidden manuscripts reveal a much more sophisticated strategy. Strategically given power returns multiplied. This is the paradox that the true teachers of the influence have understood over the centuries. In the private chambers of the Vecchio Palace, Machiavelli watched how the most effective leaders were not those who monopolized the entire authority, but those who knew when and how to give it to create an impossible psychological debt to settle. This dynamic operates under a fundamental principle of human psychology. When someone gives us power over them, we feel an almost irresistible obligation of not abusing that power and, more importantly, of corresponding to loyalty. Imagine the moment when someone entrusts you with a truly compromising secret. At that moment, he is giving you power over them, the power to damage them. Paradoxically, this act does not make you a threat but a firmer ally. Strategically revealed vulnerability creates a more powerful link than any demonstration of strength. Machiavelli codified this technique as the calculated confession, the art of revealing apparent weaknesses that, in reality, zan the seducer and create a feeling of privileged intimacy. Note how great leaders often share stories of their past failures, creating an emotional connection that no success could generate. The most powerful manifestation of this paradox occurs when you allow the objective of your influence to make decisions that directly affect your well-being. Machiavelli wrote, "When you allow another to decide on matters that concern you deeply, plants in your mind the seed of a tree whose roots are intertwined with their own sense of honor. Turning that tree would mean tearing yourself." This technique was exemplified when Machiavelli, after his release from prison, asked Lorenzo de' Medici to decide whether to continue writing political treatises or completely abandon his vocation. In ordering this crucial decision, Machiavelli not only obtained sponsorship to write, but transformed his former adversary into a defender of his intellectual legacy. The contemporary application of this strategy requires a nuanced understanding of the difference between authentic vulnerability and transparent manipulation. The assigned power must be genuine. You must be willing to accept the negative result. It is precisely this real risk that gives the technique its psychological power. However, the careful selection of what to give in and at what time to do it is what separates the master from the fan. There is an inherent tension in this paradox that few manage to navigate effectively. Giving too much power too soon makes you irrelevant. Not giving enough keeps the barriers that prevent true influence. The optimal point, what Machiavelli called the moment of investment, occurs when you have established enough value through the previous techniques so that your vulnerability is perceived as strength. The fascinating thing about this paradox is that it also operates in personal, professional, and political relationships. The boss who occasionally asks for advice to his subordinates, the teacher who admits not to have all the answers, the political leader who recognizes specific errors, all are using versions of this technique, consciously or unconsciously. The story is full of examples where apparently assigned power returns multiplied. Caesar rejecting the crown to finally obtain more power than any king. Great entrepreneurs who yield actions to ensure unwavering loyalty. Spiritual leaders who serve their followers to be revered as teachers. The dynamic is as old as the power itself, but its systematic articulation remained hidden in the manuscripts that we are exploring. The fourth principle of the forbidden Machiavelli method is entered into even deeper psychological territory, the alchemy of opposites. This concept, barely insinuated in The Prince, but extensively developed in his hidden writings, reveals an uncomfortable truth about human nature. We feel irresistibly attracted to what presents apparently contradictory qualities. Machiavelli observed that the leaders who kept their cuts completely captivated were not the perfectly virtuous or absolutely fearsome, but those who manifested disconcerting combinations of opposite attributes. The ideal prince could show ruthless cruelty followed by sincere compassion, intellectual rigor together with emotional vulnerability, absolute certainty alternated with moments of contemplative doubt. This dynamic operates under a fundamental psychological principle. The human mind constantly seeks patterns and coherence. When we face a personality that does not easily adjust to our pre-established categories, we enter a state of cognitive tension that demands resolution. This state, far from repelling us, catches us in a continuous fascination cycle while trying to decipher the living enigma in front of us. Imagine for a moment the most influential person you have known personally. If you carefully examine your behavior, you will probably discover these apparently contradictory combinations. The mentor that demanded relentless excellence while showing an infinite patience with your mistakes. The leader who could be absolutely firm in fundamental principles but surprisingly flexible in minor issues. These combinations are not accidental, but manifestations of this alchemy that we are exploring. In his manuscripts, Machiavelli detailed how to deliberately cultivate these complementary opponents. It is not simply to behave inconsistent, that would only generate distrust. Art lies in developing seemingly opposite facets of personality and revealing them in contexts where they create maximum impact. The technique he called El Dance of Opposites consists in first establishing a clear expectation about your character, allowing this image to be completely solidified in the mind of the objective, and then controlled its opposite. The fierce warrior that is moved to tears before poetry, the rigorous intellectual that shows an overflowing passion for the dance, the strict moralist that confesses a particular weakness. The crucial thing in this technique is that both facets must be authentic. We are not talking about making false personalities, but of allowing contradictory aspects that we all have naturally, but that society has conditioned us to suppress in favor of consistency. It is precisely this authenticity that differentiates Machiavellian alchemy from superficial manipulation. Machiavelli himself used this technique masterfully. Known for his cold and calculator of power, he surprised his interlocutors with moments of passionate idealism about the future of Florence. This combination made it an irresistible enigma for the powerful who sought to understand it, to determine if it represented a threat or an asset. Modern neuroscience confirms what Machiavelli signaled. The contrasting emotional experiences release cocktails from neurotransmitters that intensify the imprint of the moment in our memory. The teacher of the influence that takes you from laughter to crying, from certainty to doubt, creates a deeper neurological connection than who maintains a single emotional note, however positive it is. However, there is a critical threshold in the application of this technique. If the opposites occur too abruptly, or without a context that allows them to integrate them consistently, the mind of the objective will not experience fascination but alarm. Art lies in revealing these contradictions at a pace that allows the other to gradually adjust its perception without activating its defenses. This alchemy of opposites explains why historical figures such as Cleopatra, Napoleon, or contemporary figures such as Steve Jobs generated such fascination. It was not simply their power or achievements, but its ability to embody apparently irreconcilable qualities that made them gravitational centers of attention and influence. The fifth element of the forbidden method enters us in the most dangerous and powerful territory, the invisible architecture of desire. Machiavelli understood that the supreme influence is not achieved by satisfying existing desires, but creating new desires that only you seem to be able to satisfy. This is the true alchemy of power, transforming the will of others without having awareness of such transformation. In prohibited manuscripts, Machiavelli details a technique that called significant ilotto, the significant vacuum. This concept, precursor of contemporary psychological theories, postulates that human beings can develop intense desires towards abstract objectives that lack defined contours. The master of the influence does not offer immediate specific solutions, but first creates a longing space, a sense of lack that did not exist previously. This technique operates under a fundamental principle. Human desire is not an answer to objective needs, but a product of carefully cultivated subjective perceptions. Think about how before the existence of the iPhone, no one felt the vital need to have a device with those specific characteristics. However, after their introduction, millions developed such an intense desire that they were willing to make significant economic sacrifices to satisfy it. The architecture of desire begins with the introduction of what Machiavelli called the unattainable horizon, a vision of possibility that redefines the present as insufficient. This vision should never be presented as a direct criticism of the current state, but as a gentle revelation of an unrealized potential. You do not say your life is incomplete, but plants the seed, imagine what could be possible. Machiavelli used this technique masterfully when, instead of directly criticizing the policies of the Medici, he began to share stories about ancient Rome and their achievements. Without ever establishing an explicit comparison, he created an implicit contrast that made contemporary Florence seem to decrease. Soon, the rulers themselves began to express discontent with conditions that previously considered satisfactory. The second phase of this architecture consists in what manuscripts describe as the fragmented mirror, the technique of reflecting the objective not as it is, but as it could be if it embraced the transformation that you are subtly suggesting. Crucially, this potential image must contain authentic elements of your current personality, magnified and perfected. Must re-know in this future, but feel the gap between both versions simultaneously. The fascinating thing about this technique is that it operates completely under the threshold of critical consciousness. The objective experiences a desire that seems to have emerged spontaneously from its interior, without understanding that it has been carefully architected through indirect suggestions. As Machiavelli wrote, the true prince makes the people wish what he needs to want, while they believe that the yearning is completely his. The contemporary manifestation of this technique can be observed in everything, from sophisticated advertising campaigns to charismatic leaders who transform initially apathetic followers into passionate devotees. The mechanism is always the same. First create a specific existential vacuum and then present itself as the only bridge towards its resolution. However, there is a crucial dividing line between legitimate influence and destructive manipulation in the application of this technique. When the architect of desire leads to the objective towards a genuine and positive development, we are in the field of transformative influence. When he directs it towards self, destruction, or sick dependence, we have crossed to dark territory. Machiavelli himself established surprisingly clear ethical limits in his private manuscripts. He argued that the architecture of desire oriented exclusively to the prince's benefit without consideration for the well-being of the influenced would eventually generate resistance and resentment. The supreme mastery consisted of aligning the implanted desire with a genuine benefit to the receiver, thus creating a positive reinforcement cycle. This perspective reveals a rarely discussed Machiavelli dimension. Its understanding that lasting influence should contain an authentic reciprocity element. The desires that we architect in others must lead them to improved versions of themselves if we want to maintain our long-term influence. Otherwise, we are simply manipulating to obtain temporary advantages, a strategy that inevitably collapses. The architecture of desire perhaps represents the most controversial aspect of the forbidden method, precisely because it blurs the line between free will and external influence. To what extent are we architects of our own desires? How many of our deepest desires have been carefully cultivated by teachers of the influence around us? These uncomfortable questions inevitably emerge when contemplating the power of this technique. The final and deepest element of the forbidden Machiavelli method is what their manuscripts call il patto non detto, the not pronounced pact. This concept represents the culmination of all the previous techniques and constitutes the esoteric core of its influence system. While the previous principles operate mainly in the psychological field, the silent pact transcends almost metaphysical territory, creating a link that goes beyond words and explicit commitments. In essence, the silent pact is a tacit alliance that forms when two people recognize mutually truths that cannot be openly expressed. Machiavelli observed that the most powerful connections between individuals are not forged through formal contracts or public statements, but through the shared recognition of uncomfortable realities that society prefers to ignore. This pact operates under a fundamental principle. Human beings live constantly divided between the consensual social reality that must be navigated publicly and their private perceptions that frequently contradict this official narrative. When they find someone who recognizes this duality without explicitly articulating it, a deep complicity is established that transcends any conventional link. Machiavelli documented how he used this technique to become the closest confidant of rulers who initially distrusted him. Instead of trying to gain his trust through compliments or services, he simply demonstrated through subtle observations that understood the contradictions inherent in power, the necessary lies, the appearances that should be maintained, the abyss between the public image and the private realities of the government. The implementation of the silent pact begins with what Machiavelli called the oblique recognition, the ability to indirectly validate the unpatient perceptions of the other. You never say, "I know that you really think X," even if you say, and publicly. Instead, you make comments that would only make sense for someone to hold that private truth. It is a metaphorical wink that communicates, "I see what no one else sees, and I don't need you to confirm it." The fascinating thing about this technique is that it operates completely outside the scope of the explaining rational mind. Two people united by a silent pact often could not articulate exactly what connects them so deeply. There is an almost mystical sensation of, "This understands how the world really works," that transcends any practical benefit of the relationship. Machiavelli refined this technique until it becomes an art. He knew that the silent pact had to be constructed gradually, through small, cumulative signals rather than through great gestures, a seemingly casual observation about human nature that resonates deeply, a strategic omission when everyone else is repeating acceptable settings, an eloquent silence in the face of a social falsehood that both recognize but no one else questions. The contemporary manifestation of this technique can be observed in transformative mentor-disciple relationships, unwavering professional alliances, and even in the deepest romantic connections. The common element is always the same, a mutual recognition of truths that exist beyond socially acceptable discourse. However, there is an inherent danger in the formation of these pacts. When established between individuals with manipulative intentions, they can become destructive conspiracies against the common good. Machiavelli was painfully aware of this possibility, and their manuscripts warn about the difference between silent pacts that recognize suppressed realities to operate more effectively within imperfect systems, and those who seek to exploit these realities for exclusively personal benefit. The ethical dimension of the silent pact lies precisely in this distinction. Does the shared recognition of social contradictions allow us to better serve others, or simply give us advantages to exploit them? Machiavelli argued that the first option was not only ethically superior, but strategically more sustainable. What makes the silent pact so powerfully binding is that it creates an impossible debt to articulate and, therefore, impossible to settle completely. When someone recognizes your deepest truth, without demanding that confessions establish a connection that operates outside the conventional exchange economies, You cannot simply return the favor, because the favor itself exists in a domain that transcends ordinary transactions. Machiavelli wrote enigmatically about this phenomenon. Whoever sees you without demanding that you show you has given you a gift that you cannot name but you will never forget. In that silent recognition lies the most durable power. This observation reveals the almost spiritual dimension of the Machiavellian method that history has consistently ignored. Beyond the manipulation tactics for which it is popularly known, Machiavelli understood that the supreme influence emerges from the ability to recognize the complete humanity of the other, with all its contradictions, weaknesses, and uncomfortable truths. Do you feel that tremor inside you? It is the recognition of a power that has always been there, asleep under layers of social conditioning. Machiavelli's method is not an external technique that you apply mechanically. It is an awakening to the true nature of human influence. As a scalpel in inexperienced hands, this knowledge can deeply hurt both who wields it and who receives it. But in the hands of the one who understands its true essence, it becomes an instrument of liberation. Who does not apply these teachings is at the mercy of those who do, moving as a puppet in a theater whose strings cannot see. True power is never announced, never begs attention. It operates in the intermediate spaces, in the pauses between words, in the silence that follows a revealed truth. If you have felt that chill of recognition while listening, you are already part of an ancient tradition that transcends cultures and epochs. Comment right now, "I see the invisible," and join those who have aroused. Next time, I will reveal the lost manuscript that explains how the big,